Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to the Office for Students Degree Apprenticeships Funding webinar. I'm really pleased to see so many people here today. The numbers are creeping up slowly, so this introductory piece, I'll just walk us through what we're going to do today as people continue to join. My name is Jack Smith. I am Head of Pathways and Funding Policy here at the Office for Students, and I am responsible for the work that we do at the office around all things that aren't three-year degrees, so technical education, degree apprenticeships, the lifelong loan entitlement. It's really nice to see so many of you join us here today. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So we're going to start with our event notices. This is the online equivalent of telling everyone where the toilets are and whether there'll be a fire alarm. We have closed captions available today. There's a CC icon on your screen, so if you need to use those, please do. Just a reminder, those are automatically generated, so if there are any oddities, then apologies for that. There will be a recording of this event available on the OFS website if colleagues aren't able to join or you want to watch back. We are going to be using the Q&A box rather than the chat box for asking questions. We want to get some information and ideas from you all towards the end of the session and just answer any questions you may have. But if you can do that through the Q&A box rather than the chat box. If you've got an issue with the event itself, the events team are available through the chat box. So if you can't hear us properly or you've got a problem with your connection, then please use the chat box for those kind of queries. So all of those things done, let's move into the main part of the webinar today. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we're here today to talk to you about the degree apprenticeships funding. The purpose of our session is to inform you of what we're looking to achieve through this fund, look to engage you in that work, and to hopefully generate some enthusiasm for potential bids that you might want to submit in the future. We've got an hour with you. We're going to talk to you for a little bit about the fund itself and what it looks like and timelines, and then we've got plenty of space for questions and answers at the end. We don't need to keep everyone here if it's all relatively straightforward, but we will leave plenty of time for questions. When we work through those questions, we'll obviously be prioritising questions about the funding, but if you did have other questions about the OFS's role in relation to degree apprenticeships, we may well pick those up offline. So just in terms of prioritising the time we have available with you. So the team's going to set out our current thinking around the funding programme and some timelines for you, so you can start thinking about your own plans after the summer. And as I say, there'll be plenty of time for you to ask any questions. So if you move to the next slide, please. So why are we here today? I'm really excited to be here with you all today. We know at the OFS that degree apprenticeships have got so much to offer for students, for employers, for universities and colleges across the country. And we at the OFS want to play our part in making sure that degree apprenticeships can grow and succeed. So we're going to be distributing £16 million this year. There may be a further £24 million available in the next financial year, although that is subject to budget decisions. And you can find the full details of the announcement of the funding, which we put out on the 22nd of June. I think there'll be a link appearing in the notes for you. We're at the scoping stage of the guidance document. So we're gonna talk about where we expect things to end up, but there will be a finalised guidance document in September 2023. So what you're hearing from us today is our initial thinking, where we are on this, but there may be a bit of change as we get through to that final guidance. One of the reasons we may change those things is because we're going to be asking you about what you'd find helpful to be in the bidding guidance. So we're considering different ways about how we might distribute the funding. We expect it to be a competitive process, though, rather than a formulaic one. We haven't made any of those final decisions, and we'll do so before publication in September. We've already been having some really helpful conversations with representative groups and other stakeholders across the sector. So we've held useful conversations with University UK, the Association of Colleges, Guild HE, Independent HE, the University Vocational Awarding Council, Tech Skills, and we're also in close conversation with the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education and the Department for Education to understand the wider degree apprenticeships landscape and other funding streams that are available. So we want to make sure that there's appropriate connections across those different governmental and non-governmental bodies. So what we want to do with you today is to make sure that you can leave the session to start thinking and talking with your colleagues and local employers about how you might use funding that will be available. We want you to leave with thoughts about how the fund might deliver your existing strategy. So where you have growth plans or things that you would like to be doing, but there are some blocks to achieving that. We'd like you to be thinking about how this fund can help you do that. And we want to hear from you about how we can help you prepare the best possible bids. So what things would you find helpful to see in the guidance in order to best prepare the highest quality bid that you can? We're going to finalise our guidance using any input that we get from today and through our wider policy work. And Davina's going to set out some timelines at the end of our presentation so you can see what that looks like. Before I hand over to Alistair Wilson, who's going to take you through the next part of this, I just want to say this webinar is the start of the conversation about this pot of funding. It's a journey that's going to last the next couple of years, and we really hope that as many of you as possible can submit bids and join us on that journey, and that we can do what we can to support all of the excellent work that you're doing in growing and developing degree apprenticeships. So I'm going to hand over to Al for the next part of the session.
Thank you, Jack. It's great to see so many familiar names on the registration list, and hopefully many of you have actually been able to turn up. Just to share that I'm in my first month of working here at the OFS, having previously worked in a provider focusing on skills-based higher education for over 20 years. I'm really excited to be joining the OFS at this time and to be part of this team delivering this fund, which I believe has so much potential to help support and shape degree apprenticeship growth over the coming years, and at a time where the provision type has so much focus and attention. During this session of the webinar, I'll provide information on the aims, outcome, eligibility, and expected scope of the fund. Thank you. If we can have the next slide. So when we're thinking about the aims of the fund, we think that degree apprenticeships contribute to diversity of provision in the English higher education sector. This enables students to have choice, contributes to local and regional prosperity and skills development, and equality of opportunity in higher education. During 21-22, there were 226 providers at the approved fee cap without OFS fundable level 6 apprenticeships. Of the 82 degree apprenticeship standards that were being delivered in that year, over half had fewer than 100 starts, and 55 standards had fewer than 10 providers. We see this data on degree apprenticeships as demonstrating a problem with getting some standards to market. Degree apprenticeship recruitment focusing on just a handful of standards will not deliver the benefits of diversity described above, and therefore we're looking at using the funding to drive a change in behaviour of providers and to help tilt the field towards delivering the aims as have been set out. Can I have the next slide, please? So now considering the expected outcomes of this funding, the expected outcomes of this fund at this time focus on two possible strands as well as a cross-cutting theme. There are 114 providers at the approved fee cap who currently are delivering OFS fundable level 6 apprenticeships, and strand 1 is focused on an expansion within these providers delivering more standards. As previously mentioned, there are 226 providers at the approved fee cap who are currently not delivering OFS fundable level 6 apprenticeships, and strand 2 is focused on these providers delivering more OFS fundable level 6 apprenticeships. The cross-cutting theme seeks to increase starts and evidence growth amongst apprenticeships in lower socioeconomic groups and younger people and other underrepresented groups in apprenticeship provision that aligns to the OFS objectives. And this might include growing the number of apprenticeships on existing standards from underrepresented groups, for example, through the alignment with access and participation activity. Can I have the next slide, please? So who is eligible to bid? Only OFS registered providers in the approved fee cap can lead bids for the funding. However, it is possible that providers who are not OFS registered in the approved fee cap could partner with providers who are. We're also seeking bids from providers to expand existing apprenticeship provision, but they will need to be on the register of apprenticeship training providers. Where you may not be yet on the register of apprenticeship training providers, it is expected that you'll need to demonstrate that you're in the process of registration or that you don't have approval for a standard that is ready to be delivered yet. As we say, only those on approved FAC can apply, but others could work in partnership with those on the register. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So now considering the So what's expected to be in and out of scope of the bid? We expect bids that demonstrate that they'll build capacity and increase starts on level 6 apprenticeships. As previously mentioned, collaborative bids could, but are not limited to those who include those who are on the approved OFS fee cap. We understand that there may also be some side benefits for related level 4 and 5 higher apprenticeships, and that these may complement the growth of level 6 apprenticeships. But bids focusing exclusively on level 4 or 5 apprenticeships without pipelines will be unlikely to be funded. We aren't expecting this funding to be used for the development of new standards, and therefore trailblazer groups won't be able to bid. The funding is not able to be used for capital expenditure. The OFS has provided capital funding through formula and bidding exercises, which provide an opportunity to apply for funding for technical education and degree apprenticeships. And the events team will now share that link with the participants. But we do recognise the importance of funding capital and will continue to consider this with any further capital rounds that may be available. So that's what we're currently thinking will be in and out of scope. And now I'll pass over to Davina, who will share with us the expected timelines and next steps. Thank you, Davina.
Thanks, Al. Good morning, everyone. My name is Davina Benton, and I'm the Programme Manager at OFS for this funding competition. So I'm just going to take you through the expected timeline and next steps, and just to stress that this is the expected timeline, and there may be a shift in some of the dates. So here we are, July 2023, with this soft launch of the funding competition webinar. As Jack's already mentioned, we're aiming for guidance to be published and the funding competition to officially open in September. October, we're planning to have another webinar similar to this. So when you've had a few weeks to consider the guidance, we'll open up another webinar for you to come and ask any further questions or queries. December 2023, don't worry, we will make it before Christmas, will be the deadline for bids and the funding competition to close. It's not on this slide, but January and February, we will be internally assessing the bids within the OFS. And then March 2024 is when we aim to announce all the successful bids, with payments starting in the April. Just to say on this, it's a very, very tight time frame. So we're really trying to balance here, giving providers, yourselves, enough time to write and develop those bids, whilst getting the funding out by April next year. In bold at the bottom of this slide, and Jack's already mentioned this, these timelines are based on what we're still calling wave 1 of the funding, which is the £16 million that's already been confirmed by DFE. There may be a further wave 2, which will be announced in spring 2024, but that is subject to the DFE funding confirmation for financial year 24-25. But at this stage, we do anticipate that for wave 2 and any future waves of funding, that the September 2023 bidding guidance will likely be remain in place. Next slide, please. So now, yeah, it's really an opportunity to get your views. I realise that we have shared a lot with you in quite a short space of time, so it's quite a lot to take in. So we've given a couple of prompts here on what it'd be really helpful to hear about from you. So as mentioned, we're developing the final guidance ahead of September. So what would help you as a provider, or if you're not from a provider, what would help you to engage with your provider colleagues to prepare effective bids that can help us to achieve the goals you've heard about today? And also, are there any particular kinds of activity that you think would achieve our anticipated outcomes? So maybe for those of you who already work in this space, what kind of activities do you think this funding could support? But of course, these are just some pointers, and we're really happy to hear any other views or questions on any of this. So if you haven't done so already, if you could now at this point, please share any comments and questions in the Q&A box. Next slide, please. And hopefully Alistair and Jack will join me back on screen, and I will hand back over to Jack.
Thank you very much, Davina. So we've had a couple of questions come in, so we will tackle those ones first, and then if people add their questions as we go. So I'm going to ask the first question that I've got here is, will independent training providers be able to receive funding alongside higher education institutions? The question says, we're aware they may not be OFS registered, but they do offer quite a lot of level 4 to 7. Davina, can you take that one?
So I think as long as those independent providers are OFS registered, then yes, they could lead a bid. But as I think it was Al mentioned, we are also open to collaborative bids. So for any providers that aren't currently OFS registered in the approved fee cap, you could partner with another provider.
Great. Thank you very much, Davina. We've got another question about scope here. So Al, I wonder if you can take this one. It says, is level 7 provision in scope for this fund?
So the fund is focusing on degree apprenticeships, and level 7 are categorised as degree apprenticeships. As we're working together on the guidance documentation, we'll be considering in more detail whether or not there's any specific standards which may be less likely to be funded, and that could be relating to that they've already experienced high growth in specific geographic areas. So that's a helpful comment, and if you have any further questions around levels or actual standards, we'd be pleased to listen to that to help us form our guidance documentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. And I think that's a really important message for people to take away, because the guidance document, we haven't made decisions about final scope. We're at our early stages of thinking. So if there's anything in particular that you think would be an area that would be valuable to grow that fits in with the wider aims, but you're not sure from this presentation whether it would be in scope, we'll share an email address at the end. We're really happy to hear those things, because we'll be working through those decisions as we go. So we've got we're working through the questions that are all popping up. So if we can start with this one here, which is, so there's two here that I'm going to do together, which are about kind of uncertainty of registration status at the point of the bids opening. So we've got one question which is saying, we're currently in discussions regarding a merger with another university. Should we bid or wait until those mergers are completed? And there's another question which is, we're not currently in the approved fee cap category, but we're changing category. Are we able to bid in the competition? Those kind of technical questions are things that we're absolutely going to cover in the guidance, and we'll want to walk you through those in the webinar when we get there in September. What I would say is that what Davina's set out is 2 waves, so we would hope that there would be opportunities for people to bid in one of those 2 ways. So
Jack, sorry, can I just add on this for the second question? Our intention at the moment and other funding competitions that we've run is that for providers that are currently going through the registration process or changing their from non-approved to approved fee cap, what we're saying is that as long as they are approved fee cap at the point of funding commencing, so that would be April 2024, then they can lead on a bid. Otherwise, yes, it would go back to that collaborative bid arrangement I mentioned earlier.
Great, thanks, Davina. So we've got some questions about scope here. So first question is, funding is proposed to support work to extend access to degree apprenticeships for disadvantaged students. Would it be possible to propose a plan of activity comprising work with college and school partners to raise awareness of degree apprenticeships? Al, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think that's the development of pipelines and at this stage where, as Jack and Davina have said, pulling together the guidance documentation. So growing market awareness is really important, and defining the measurable outcomes from this is something that will come through in the guidance document as well. I think at this stage we're keen not necessarily to have to direct that towards how many starts do you have and kind of that measured metric in that way, but very interested in the activity that might support growing awareness and tying in work with employers in that area as well. We're aware that as I can see just coming through in a comment now around the widening participation, that kind of general lack of awareness sometimes of degree apprenticeships having an equitable and viable alternative to traditional three-year undergraduate degrees is an area of work that can't be taken by individuals in isolation, and we very much need providers to support with that area of work as well.
Great, thanks very much, Al. Davina, there's a few questions here about timescales I'm going to pass to you. I'll try and collect a few of them together because they're broadly, how long will the project run for? And if we're going to announce funding in April, when will it have to be spent by?
That's a very good question. So the 16 million wave one funding actually technically is for financial year 2023-2024, which if we're not announcing it until March, April, that would give you literally 1 month to spend it, which is very helpful. So our intention is that is for academic year. So payments would start in April 2024 and run until the end of that academic year, which I believe is July. Jack, is that right? I always think it's August, but I think it's actually July. And then I think the other part of the question was about the sort of wave two of funding, was it? Which, like I said, is would be hopefully announced by DFE in our funding letter in spring next year, and then we would be looking to make an announcement sort of shortly after that. So I guess it would be sort of May, June next year.
Thanks, Davina. Davina mentioned in her timescale slide that there's a balance that we're trying to strike here. So there's a point at which we get confirmation of funding. So we get 1 year funding grants from the DFE. We get that funding allocated to us. You'll have seen the letter from DFE came out in April this year. We then have to go through our processes to make sure that that funding can be allocated to the sector. And what we're trying to balance is enough time in the window for you to prepare and present bids, but also think about that spending. So part of what we're trying to do today is start that thinking process so we can get through that. We're really open to suggestions around timelines and particularly bidding windows and things like that. And we'll set out all the details when we come to the guidance in September. But just say we do recognise that there's the circumstances in which this funding is provided to us and then on to you comes with some challenges that we're really aware of. Great, we've got a few more questions here. So I'm going to try and get this some collectively around partnerships. So we've got, I'll try and group them together and then we can possibly wrap up after this question because we've got a couple more slides. Oh no, hang on, we've got loads of time. It's 11:30 we finish. Sorry, got plenty of time. I thought we were finishing at 11. So on partnerships, Davina, we've got, do partners have to be UK based? Can organisations be part of one bid? And do we need letters of support alongside the submission?
Okay, so I'll take the last question first. Yes, our intention is generally we would always ask for sort of a letter of support, both from the lead provider and any partner providers. I think the second question was about, was it collaboration, Jack?
So how many bids can you be part of?
Okay, so providers can, well, at the moment we're thinking, and generally in this space, our rules normally, they can, providers can only lead one bid, but they can partner in other bids. And the first question was...
First one was, do partners have to be UK based?
Oh, might have to put that one back to you, Jack. I'm guessing so.
Yeah, so we would normally expect that, but we can, if there are particular examples of where you think there would be benefits to projects with international partners, it would be one of those things we'd be really interested in hearing about, so we can make sure that we shape the guidance in a way that is clear about either how that might be possible, or if it's not possible, the rationale for that. So we'll share that email address towards the end, and we can look at that in the guidance. Al, I've got a question here about whether we are prioritising any specific subject areas.
So I mentioned quite a lot of data when I was going through the slides, and as we're working through the guidance document, we may consider directing the guidance towards or directing bids towards standards which currently don't have as high a number of intake or apprentices joining those starters. As I think I mentioned a minute ago, that there are a couple of standards where there's already quite a high number of starters on those standards, particularly at level 6 and level 7. But that's not to say that there might not be local or regional reasons, or reasons within your access and participation plans why you may not want to continue to be growing standards in certain areas. So if you have some examples or specificities that you wish us to consider, please email that through, and that can help form our guidance.
Thanks very much, Alistair. We expect with the guidance as well to start pointing to some of that data, so we can help with that, but there is quite a lot of data available if you've used the Office for Student Size and Shape dashboards that start to give you some sense of subject areas where there's particularly low numbers of starts in recent years. So I've got a question here which is about level 4 and 5, and I think, Alistair, I'll pass this one to you because I think it's generated by your slide. You mentioned that you would consider levels 4 and 5 if focused on building pathways to degree apprenticeships. Would these pathways towards other new programs, or also create pathways and pipelines to feed existing apprenticeships offered by institutions already?
Yeah, so thank you. So 4 and 5 is obviously a really interesting area, and as Jack mentioned, we work within a broad guidance documentation, strategic planning guidance, and this fund is pivoted towards level degree apprenticeships, but that's not to say we don't recognise that there could be viable 4 or 5 leading into level 6s, but we're keen to be clear on ensuring that 4 and 5 isn't being funded, or may not be funded, in isolation of clear alignment with level 6. And we see this in some of the work that we've experienced in areas, for example, in engineering, where students might commence at level 4, but are very much aligned to progressing on to level 6, and it's just through the nature of employers that they might work with, SMEs, for example, where that may be prevalent. But level 4 and 5 in isolation are unlikely at this time to be funded, because this is a degree apprenticeship fund.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And I think with all of these things, that's a really good example of we'll refine in the funding guidance that comes out in September exactly how we'll score those things and the description of how that will work. But I think the message we'd like you all to go away with is this is degree apprenticeships, but we understand, particularly in widening participation, the importance of pipelines. I've got a couple of questions here that are about scope of spend, and they're really helpful in us preparing the guidance. So, Alistair, I'm going to ask you them. So one is, would the funding support providers to prepare candidates to meet any outstanding entry requirements and therefore remove any potential barriers?
That's a very interesting question, and I'm just trying to play that through with practicalities. So it may be that they don't meet the initial learning requirements or entry requirements for a degree apprenticeship. So could it be used to pump prime investment in that area, I think, is my interpretation of that question.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's probably something that I don't necessarily feel we'll be able to answer in this webinar, because it's the complexity of the guidance that we'd need to produce in order to clarify that level of detail would be something that we'd have to take away and consider, I'm afraid. Unless Jack or Davina, you have any comments on that?
I think that's right. I think this is a really helpful example, though, of the kind and the things that we'll really want to hear over the summer is the kinds of things that you as providers think will achieve our aims, because that will help us as we start to flesh out those examples of the things that definitely would or wouldn't be in scope. There's another question here that falls into the same category, but I just wanted to share it as something we'll think about when we come to do the guidance rather than something to answer straight away, which is, could the fund be used for non-capital infrastructure? For example, ensuring that we have the most robust systems in place to meet the needs for higher numbers of degree apprenticeships. That balance between capital and non-capital is something that we'll give some really specific advice on. In general, our advice around capital is that things that are kind of consumed within 12 months can be included as non-capital. So, but we can think about really expanding that advice, because we know that growing degree apprenticeships comes with a certain number of infrastructure needs, and that those might be the things that are blocking providers. So we'll both think about that for our guidance, and also, as Alistair said earlier, we've got a commitment to thinking about how we can reflect degree apprenticeships in our ongoing capital funding. And I would also point attendees to the DFE funding streams, particularly the Skills Injection Fund, which is out of the Skills Injection Fund 2, which is out at the moment, where there is opportunities for capital expenditure. I've got a question here, which I was going to pick up. So, can activities included in this bid also be included in access and participation plan spend? As I'm sure everyone will know, there's a revised access and participation plans guidance out at the moment. We're expecting the first wave of those providers to go through in the next few months, and then we will look at guidance for the next set of providers. Because we are looking for this funding to grow, to increase equality of opportunity for students seeking to study on degree apprenticeships, we would strongly expect there to be a connection between access and participation plans and this funding. I would expect that things that we deliver here, or that you may deliver here, would contribute to your overall access and participation plan strategy, so would be a feature. The exact interaction between approval of an APP and the activities that we're delivering here will be something that we'll clarify through the guidance, but you can expect that we would be supportive of very strong complementarity between those two things. So Alistair, I've got another scope question here. Does the scope include helping to stimulate demand with small and medium-sized enterprises and potential apprentices?
Yes.
So I'm going to start with that first bit and then go to the others.
Yes, and I think that's a clear example of where we would expect there to be alignment of this fund, working directly with employers, working with clusters, working with local enterprise partnerships and such like to stimulate demand is a clear examples of where this would either meet in category 1, 2, or could have a cross-cutting theme.
Great, thank you. And then we've got a question here, which is some level 6 and 7 standards do not contain degrees. Do we think that they will be in scope for the funding?
Again, we'll have to consider that within the guidance documentation. See lots of conversations that have been going on for some time now about the necessity of qualifications within any higher degree apprenticeship. But that would probably be something that we would consider to be within scope, as it would be at the level that we're expecting this fund to be utilised against.
Right, thanks, Alistair. I think some of these are really helpful examples of the things that we can use when we finalise that guidance to start providing examples for potential bidders. There's a really helpful question here, which just wanted to raise, which is, would it be possible to fund activity that supports learners to undertake added value activities outside the degree curriculum? For example, the question says we currently take assistant practitioners on a leadership day. So I'm going to slightly reframe that question. Alistair, if you can think about, I think the question is about activities that support positive outcomes for students on degree apprenticeships that go beyond the degree curriculum, and whether that's something that we might consider.
Yeah, I think if we go back to the original aims and expected outcomes, the aims are to grow capacity and capability amongst providers and to increase the number and diversity of apprentices on programmes, and the expected outcomes are to expand those who are already offering degree apprenticeships and to expand provision amongst providers who aren't. So adding value to programmes would seem to be maybe overreaching at this time the anticipated outcomes of the programme. But as Jack phrased that question around the successful outcomes of an apprentice, beyond that of undertaking the apprenticeship themselves, is again an interesting metric that we could consider when looking at the fund. So again, a really good question for us to consider and take away as we're pulling together the guidance about that added value aspect.
Great, thank you, Alistair. There's one more question here around timescales, Davina. So I'll pass this one to you, which is thinking about new programs or providers who don't have current standards. It takes a long time to design those programs, have it internally approved, etc. Given that will probably take more than a year, what are we expecting to fund in that area?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question, and we've started testing out some ideas with a few providers and also the input from this as well on actually timescales. And you're absolutely right. The real sense we're getting is it does take at least 12 months to kind of get from the sort of initially thinking about an apprenticeship all the way through to sort of validation and then starting to deliver that apprenticeship. As we have to keep coming back to this sort of really tight timeframes, this kind of wave 2 potentially of funding. So I guess it is just what this fund will be for the initial 16 million, which we do ideally need to have that funding out of the door by summer next year, is actually realistically what can, for providers, what can you kind of develop in that sort of time frame? So having those, so we would see that as being potentially, having those initial conversations internally, taking it through some of the kind of internal sort of validation processes, and then we are, obviously very hopeful that we will get that for sort of further wave 2 of funding, which will take it, more closer to the actual delivery stage. I guess that's, Jack, I'll come back to you on this, but we are really sort of aware, aren't we, that this funding is not for the actual delivery, is really just for that kind of development that providers might have already been thinking about internally, and then this just helping to kind of sort of pump prime that, really.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Davina. There's a question in that we've got here as well, which is around predicted recruitment numbers and clawback, and whether that's an approach that we're going to take. So partly the answer to that question is we'll finalize exactly what milestones and things we expect through the guidance. But we know that particularly where we're asking for development, like Davina says, that is something that takes a period of time. So we'll be fully recognizing that in the guidance and asking for milestones that show progress towards that development rather than starts on degree apprenticeships, because we know that that is unlikely to be possible in the time frame for the funding. So that's something that we want to provide really clear guidance on around in September. And then when we've got that guidance, we'll come back to quite a few of these questions and hopefully provide those really clear answers for you when we get there. So I'm just looking at a couple of other questions here. Davina, I think these, if you could pick these up, open to the fact the answer might be the guidance will clarify this, but is there a maximum value we can bid for? And if we can only make one bid, can the bid cover different themes such as partnerships and pipeline and expansion of provision?
So yeah, in the guidance document, we would definitely have to give kind of a range of, you know, what we'd be looking at for funding bids. To give people an idea, we haven't actually mentioned it today, but I think it was back in 2017, HEFCE ran two sort of funding competitions, DDAF, Degree Apprenticeship Development Fund, and to give you an indication for that, at that stage the range was £50,000 to £250,000 for a single provider and up to £500,000 for a strong collaborative bid. So that gives you an idea, but we know obviously that was, you know, 6-7 years ago, so inflation, etc., that those costs are expected to be higher. So it is something we will definitely give that guidance on in the documentation in September, and it is obviously likely that a collaborative bid would obviously have a higher cost than a single bid. And also I guess it depends how many new degree apprenticeships you're suggesting. If just one standard, then obviously that would probably be lower than if you're talking about developing 2 or 3 different degree apprenticeships in different areas. On the one bid on different themes, yes, I think that sounds great. You know, if you're just putting one bid in and it's going to cover sort of various areas, then that would definitely be acceptable. I guess it is just coming back to that point about the two, well, like the strand 1 and strand 2, and obviously you can only be a lead bidder for one of those, but that shouldn't cause any issues anyway, because that's basically providers already working in this space as opposed to providers new to this. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Davina. I've got some questions here around the HESIS submissions that are relating to degree apprenticeships. So just to introduce this, in the 22-23 OFS funding cycle, we provided funding for degree apprenticeships based on the numbers of degree apprenticeships that started in that year. So that was a formulaic allocation. It wasn't a competitive bidding process. And providers that received that would have had to complete a HESIS return to say how many students they've got. And the questions are, do these things overlap? Is it a completely separate exercise? Davina, do you want to take that one?
Yes, so so our funding team, I know that HESIS, the table in HESIS, I can't remember what number it is now, won't be applied for sort of funding moving forward, because it was there previously, as Jack said, for that formulaic allocation of 8 million in 2022-2023. So no, there isn't sort of really an overlap, although Jack's mentioned about sort of bids referring to their APP plans, and I think it would be really helpful for existing providers who did have access to that 8 million to sort of give examples of, you know, how that funding was utilised. I think would be really helpful.
Great, thank you,
maybe
Davina.
just to add to that, the funding guidance was sent out to accountable officers, I think maybe last week, outlining the strategic priorities of different recurrent funding. And just to go back to that 4 and 5 point, that there is funding set aside for level 4, 5 within that strategic priorities in that recurrent funding. But degrees, that isn't part of that recurrent funding model anymore.
Thank you, Alistair. So one of these questions for you. Providers need to address endpoint assessment readiness before they can launch a new apprenticeship. Could funds be used to address barriers in the endpoint assessment space that affect viability and deliverability?
Yes, I think we'd probably need to maybe understand that a little bit more to see if it's something that is linked to a standard or two, or a provider or two, or is more broad reaching. But again, if the person who's asked that question could email in with a little bit more detail, that will help us better understand how we might be able to consider this within the guidance documentation.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I've got another question where I suspect the answer is going to be the same. So are revisions of standards of level 6 apprenticeships in scope? So we may already be offering a standard, but the revision means that we need to recreate or update our delivery or content. Would that be in scope for funding?
So I think, as Davina's already mentioned, what's not expected to be in scope is the delivery costs, but the preparation for delivery, we recognise has been and continues to be a barrier in getting some standards off the ground. So as standards are revised, then that potentially could be, because that would meet the anticipated outcomes of the project, of the fund.
Yeah. And I think that there is a theme here that we will capture all of these questions and make sure we reflect on the guidance, which is the overall aim of this project is to kind of help stimulate the market and grow starts and the numbers of standards. So if there are things that are preventing you from either getting into the market or from growing your provision, those are the kinds of things that we would in general be hoping to fund within the limitations that we have. So all of these examples are really helpful as we start to finalize what goes into our guidance. So I have another question here, which is, and Davina, if you could pick this one up, is there a limit to the number of applications that can be made? For example, my own institution could apply for funding against 2 different standards. Should we combine them as one bid, or would it be our preference that each institution only submits one bid?
So I think it does come back to that point about each provider can only lead on one bid. So I guess if it's 2 standards that you want to kind of increase in or develop, and it's just within your provider, then you would need to put that into one bid. But it sounds like you might be working in partnership with another provider, so I guess you'd have to discuss with them if one of you leads on one and is a partner in the other, or vice versa.
Yeah, thanks, Davina. I'm going to find us one last question, which is one about marketing materials. So we talk about stimulating demand. Does this mean that that bids could be used on marketing materials as well as development of programs? Davina, could you tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would see that, yes, this is that funding could be used for marketing, because it comes back to those points of the aims of the overall competition to kind of, to drive up the numbers of degree apprenticeships. So and obviously marketing, information, advice and guidance is all a big part of that. So yes.
Great, thank you, Davina. So I'm going to, there's one last question here that I think is really helpful, but I know that we don't have the answer for. So the question is, will providers need to bid again for funding in 24-25? So we've talked about both waves. We've talked about the issues around the delivery challenges within the timeframes we've got here, but we know that we intend to kind of continue the same approach across both waves, and therefore would a provider need to bid again? I think what I would say is that's a really helpful question, and one that we will have to clarify through the final guidance. But we're keen to do as much as we can to offer predictability of funding, because we know that's really important in development activity, and also that we reduce burden on providers and ourselves through that process. So that's one of those things that we will look really carefully at through the guidance. It may be that we need to take a slightly staged approach to that, because as I said at the top, we don't yet have the budget approval for the funding for 24-25, but as soon as that comes through, we can think about that. So that's something we'll want to tackle in the final guidance. Sorry, there is one more question that I think we can answer really quickly, which is, will there be any expectation around match funding?
Good question. We haven't really thought about that. I mean, I think if there was funding coming from employers as well, or kind of in-kind funding, then I think we will be picking that up through the bidding template. But yeah, I might put that one back to you, Jack, about whether there must be, because I know sometimes in some of our funding competitions there's a requirement to have match funding, but I don't think that we've got to that stage of thinking.
So that's right, Davina. We haven't got a final decision on those things. Value for money is clearly an aspect that we look at in all of our funding programs. So if there are ways in which you can bring additional value to your bid through match funding or contributions in kind, then those are things that are likely to be of interest. We haven't set out with a aim for this funding pot that is to generate match funding from the sector. So as Davina says, there are some programs. So for example, our postgraduate conversion course program, which really explicitly sought to generate additional funding to match the funding we were providing. That's not one of the aims that we're setting out for with this program. So thank you all for all of your questions. There are a few that we didn't manage to get to, and I've seen a couple that are really specific that I think we can just come back to you offline. So hopefully we can answer those questions. Can we go to the kind of final slides, please? So we wanted to just leave you all with a sense of what you can do now. So we hope this has been helpful. We recognise it's high level, but we really hope that this was a useful way of starting the conversation with you about how we think the funding is going to work, and kind of give you a sense of where that's going to go. It'd be really helpful if you can go away and start thinking about where you might benefit within your organisation or in your local area for bids for this funding. And that might mean conversations internally, that might mean conversations with employers or your partners. And you will all have different internal approval discussions that you need to go through. So we hope that you can start to have those conversations now, so that when we publish the final guidance in September, that you're in a really good place to be able to put a bid together. There have been some really helpful suggestions that we will think about as we prepare that guidance. And we're really hopeful that we can get that out as soon as possible, so we can get things started. If we can go to the next slide, please. So finally, we just wanted to flag a couple of things. Firstly, these slides and the recording will be available on our website, so you can share it with colleagues. The Degree Apprenticeships email address that's up on your screen, we're going to be here over the summer. So if you have any questions about what you've heard today, or you go away and reflect on it and you want to come back and ask us, then please do email us. We'll be happy to have further conversations. If there are specific things that you want to know that we think might be helpful for others, we'll think about how we share those, but that's likely to all be tackled through the guidance that we're going to publish in September. We'll do another one of these, as Davina said, once the guidance is published. So we'll publish the guidance, give you a little bit of time to digest it, and then come with specific questions. And we will hold that. We're anticipating that will be in October. So I just want to say thank you again for all of your time and your questions. Please do get in touch if there's anything else that we can answer in the short term. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all again in October once we've published the guidance. So thank you for your time, and we'll end the webinar here.